Awesome. All right, well, it looks like the number is evening out. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this awesome event. My name is Courtney. I'm a bookseller at Grassroots and the event coordinator downtown in Corvallis, Oregon. And today we have author Justin St Germain with us for his book, Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, and he's joined in conversation with author Elena Passarello. Justin's book, Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, is one of the best-selling American books of all time and the originator of the hugely popular true crime genre. In the latest volume in IG's acclaimed Bookmarked series, award-winning author Justin St Germain writes about his obsession with Capote's book. St Germain traces his own history with In Cold Blood, including a trip to Holcomb, Kansas, the site of the Clutter murders it claims to be about, as well as the book's long and complicated legacy and its profound effect on him, Capote, the people it portrays, and American culture's attitude towards murder. Justin is the author of In Cold Blood, part of the publishing Bookmarked series, and the memoir Son of a Gun, which won the Barnes & Noble Discover Award and was named a best book of 2013 by many outlets. He is also a teacher at Oregon State University. Elena Passarello is the author of 2 collections of essays, Let Me Clear My Throat and Animals Strike Curious Poses. She teaches nonfiction at Oregon State University and appears weekly on the national syndicated radio program Livewire. All right, so I'm just gonna give a brief rundown of how this event is gonna work. We're gonna have Justin and Elena in conversation for the majority of the event, and then we'll open up the floor to an audience Q&A for the last 15 to 20 minutes. So at any time during their conversation, if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A chat box, and then at the end of the event, we're gonna use that chat box to run the Q&A portion. And then also the link to buy In Cold Blood will be in the chat shortly. I highly encourage you to buy it from our bookstore, Grassroots. Not only will you be supporting Justin as an author, but you'll also be supporting our bookstore, Grassroots, as a small indie bookstore that's able to bring events like this to you. Okay, and without further ado, I'm gonna let Justin and Elena take it away.
Okay, thank you, Courtney. So I guess we had said, I'm just gonna read real quickly a couple pages here, and then we're gonna jump in and just talk a little bit about the book. But first, I want to thank Courtney. I want to thank Grassroots. Obviously, I want to thank Elena. This is huge. I really appreciate it. And everybody who's here. It's nice to see some familiar names and not so much faces, but you know, it's the next best thing. So I'm going to read just like 2 pages. This is from the 4th part of the book. The book has 4 parts, and like In Cold Blood, which is why it has 4 parts. And in the 4th part, I talk about a class I teach at OSU now, which is true crime. It's a true crime class. I call it in the book, you're going to see True Crime 101. That's not the actual course name. Everything's kind of been anonymized to protect the privacy of the people in it. But this is about the first time I taught that class, which I believe was the last spring, or it could have been last winter, because it was the last class I taught. The pandemic started like finals week. So this is about teaching True Crime 101. True Crime 101 focuses on American true crime works. For reasons both practical, we only have 10 weeks. I don't know British literature nearly as well, and philosophical. One of the implicit arguments is that true crime is an American creation, a black mirror reflecting our collective fears and preoccupations. That's what the syllabus says, at least. As I write this, I'm teaching the course for the first time, so I'm flying by the seat of my pants. We start 3 centuries before Capote, with a paragraph from William Bradford's History of Plymouth about the colony's first execution. In 1630, a pilgrim named John Billington shot and killed another man during a quarrel. The colonists tried Billington and hung him in public. This wasn't the first true story about a crime. Indigenous oral traditions tell of crimes and their effects on a community, and the Bible was the prototype for colonial crime stories. Bradford's isn't even the written account of a murder as now America. Spanish writers had been publishing chronicles of torture, murder, and genocide in the Caribbean for a century before him. The story of John Billington is one of the first examples written in English in what is now America. Besides, it's in the textbook. On the first day of class, by the time we read about John Billington, I've introduced myself, made a few tense attempts at humor, gone over the syllabus, and answered a few questions that are mostly about whether I take attendance. Just as my students are starting to whisper, rustle papers, dig in bags, performing their desire to leave, I put the text up on the projector, read the paragraph out loud, and ask what they notice. I don't expect much, but they're game. We list on the board a few characteristics of Bradford's account that might apply to other true crime. Some are examples of what I call, for purposes of the class, truth claims, or ways a text asserts its basis in reality. Real places, real people, real names, and so on. We discuss how the term true crime is itself a truth claim, implying that crime is somehow fictional. We talk about what kind of crimes the genre covers, murder mostly, and what aspects of those crimes it focuses on. Bradford is a useful example. 300 years before true crime existed, he seems to inherently understand something about how an American murder story should be told. Not just the crime itself, but the investigation, the trial, the execution, the effect on the community. We might as well be talking about Capote, but that'll be another few weeks. I had planned to spend the first month or so of the class working our way through the early years of the genre, with precursors of modern true crime. There's a lot of good stuff in the textbook. Cotton Mather, Ben Franklin, Hawthorne, Twain, Mitchell, Mencken, Liebling. But before our first class ends, a student informs me that the campus bookstore doesn't have our textbook in stock. After class, I call the bookstore and the plot thickens. The employee suggests I may have forgotten to order it. I tell him I have evidence that proves otherwise. He says there might be a problem on the publisher's end. At the beginning of our next class, I suggest we launch an investigation, break into groups and delegate tasks, call the publisher, find the invoice, maybe even do a Freedom of Information Act request for the bookstore's emails. It's a state university, so they're public records. Talk to the principals involved, visit the warehouse, crack the case of the missing textbooks, solve our own true crime. My students endure my lame attempt at humor for a few minutes, then mercifully interrupt and ask what we're going to do. I shrug and tell them we'll just spend more time on In Cold Blood. It's easier for me anyway. I can teach that book in my sleep. Okay, so that's that whole passage. It goes on a little bit longer to cover kind of the rest of the class, but I'm not gonna, that's as much as I'm gonna read for now.
I was glad that you read to the point where you decided to try to tell them that it was going to be the class was an investigation about where their textbooks went. It's one of the many kind of like deadpan moments of humor throughout all four parts of the book that I really enjoyed.
Thanks. Yeah, I tried to make it, it's I think the subject matter is a little bleak, so you try to, include some humor here and there if you can.
Well, so maybe I want to start with something that happens kind of close to there, if I'm not mistaken. This fourth section where you talk about teaching true crime as a genre and true crime as a genre and the essay, but we'll get to that. But also you have this run of sentences that is unlike any other run of sentences in the book. You say, I admire In Cold Blood. I'm obsessed with In Cold Blood. I hate In Cold Blood. Period. And it's not the kind of book that has that kind of like, I forget what that's called. It's a great poetry term, like antistrophe or something, where you use the same thing again and again and again, repetition wise.
Is it anaphora? I don't know either.
Yeah. So yeah. But I don't know. Come on, I'm a nonfiction teacher. But so I was like, well, this is important, and I wondered if you could maybe give me a précis, a little short elaboration on all three of those sentences. What do you admire about In Cold Blood? What are you obsessed with about In Cold Blood? And what do you hate about In Cold Blood?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think I can probably say it in two things. I admire the quality of the book, right? The quality of the writing itself. I think it's a really well-written book. I think Capote is a great writer. And I sort of hate like the moral project of the book, and especially something that is not necessarily Capote's fault, which is the legacy, the influence it's had like on the genre and on murder writing and murder stories in general. And I also want to say, like, because just in case, because I think people, maybe it puts off the wrong impression, like I love Truman Capote. I think Capote's great. I find him, I mean, of course I never met him. He passed away 2 years after I was born, but everything I've learned about him makes me think I would really like Truman Capote as a person.
Yeah, it's amazing the similarities in your stories, even though I would never put the two of you together as people or as writers, even though you both have books about crime. Yeah, okay. So and then maybe tell us a little bit about your where your In Cold Blood where your relationship with Capote's book In Cold Blood began.
Sure, yeah. I'd be glad to. I mean, the book sort of follows from my first encounter with Cold Blood, which was 12, 14 years ago in grad school. It was 16 years ago, it was 2005. I took a class, a graduate literature class with a friend. He's now my friend. At the time, he was my professor, Charlie Birch, who had been one of my undergraduate professors, and just like his teaching style really resonated with me. I felt like I could really learn a lot from him. And so I took this class on the documentary Impulse, which was just this brilliant class. I mean, he's a brilliant man. And it was this just incredible class. It was one of those magic classes. And, you know, we've, as college professors, like you know those when you see them, you know, you get one every few years if you're lucky. But that class where it just something about it, the whole class has like a chemistry, and the subject matter's right, and the people are right, and the room you're in is right, and you know, and so it started there, and I read it, and I wrote a paper on it, and then I wound up coming back to it when I was writing my book, because I was kind of steeping myself in memoirs, especially, but also like memoirs about similar subjects, about violence, about, you know, whatever, however I was defining similar at the time. And read it again right before my book was due to the publisher, like 2 or 3 months. It was the last book I read while I was writing the book, the first draft of the book. And so it was obviously hugely influential, because everything you write in that period of time, everything you read in that period of time becomes really essential, you know? And so then, the second part of the book kind of covers that. The third part of the book covers when I then started teaching nonfiction, even though I had no formal schooling in it. I had an MFA in fiction. I had been working in fiction, but then I had a nonfiction book. So I get this job at New Mexico as a visiting professor and have to teach a nonfiction craft class first thing. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to teach In Cold Blood, you know, among other things. And then now the fourth part is kind of about relatively recently, where I'm teaching this true crime class. I mean, I read In Cold Blood at least once a year, you know, because I still don't like to teach without rereading it. So, and I still learn things from it. So yeah, it's been it's turned into like a pretty legitimate obsession, which is why I pitched this book. I feel like I know that book better than I know my own books.
I think it's like, I think the whole project, Justin, is like a great example of something that we as writers should feel kind of comfortable investigating. And it's the like put yourself in conversation with a book that you know well. There's this other place where I sometimes do some work. There's a teacher who's teaching a class on literary crushes. And I don't know if I would argue that you have a crush on Truman Capote, but this book really shows how you can take another author's text and have it filter through your life, through your practice, through your own kind of revision of your understanding of the text, if you've come to it in a more emotional or nostalgic place. And it just seems like such an essayistic enterprise to do that. I could read almost any of my favorite authors on doing a project similar to this, and I bet they would all be very different. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think I had read, and we've talked about it. I think probably, as much as I wouldn't necessarily claim it as the first thing that comes to mind, probably oh no, of course I'm blanking on his name, the D.H. Lawrence book, Out of Sheer Rage, Jeff Dyer.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I read that book a long time ago, and it's hard to deny that there's some influence there. You know, it was the first book I ever read that was about a writer writing a book about an obsession with another writer. And then, sorry, go ahead. You're gonna say something?
No, I'm just sorry to say that despite the harrowing nature of your book, it gave me so much fewer panic attacks. The D.H. Lawrence book, which is all about procrastination and not being able to finish something, and it tries to put you in that angsty, I haven't written what I'm supposed to write, writer's block place, which is certainly not the same thing as a multiple murder in Holcomb, Kansas. But for some reason, I found it a lot more harrowing to read.
I think you're right about, especially for the essay, if you're thinking, and I do think about this as a book length essay, obsession is a really good engine for it, right? I mean, I think about whenever I haven't read it yet, but like when I talk to you about your Elvis project, or when I talk to a book that just came out, a good friend of mine, JM Tyree, but wrote a book about Pynchon. It's called The Counterforce, and it's kind of like this. It's really great. It's just out a few weeks ago from Fiction Advocate, and it's like I just read it, and it's great because it's like it's kind of what we're talking about. It's a really smart, really sharp, really insightful, critical view of a writer, and I mean specifically one project, but also in a larger context of his other work, and the sort of the historical context, and it's just really brilliant. And I love that kind of writing. And so I'm sure there's lots of other examples that I'm blanking on now that we're doing an event, but that really appeals to me as a model for an essay.
I think it has something to do too with like a lot of books that I read that are about writing. This book is about a lot of things, as you know, because you wrote it, but I think this book is about writing. It's about thinking at a certain distance from writing, about writing, and then what you thought a writer was before you did write. Like this is all about like getting into grad school and then going to the fellowship and being around writers, and is it Colm Toybin and being on a rooftop with him in the most expensive kitchen you've ever seen or whatever. But like I think a lot of books that are about writing have a kind of abstraction attached to them. Like there's always this kind of moment where I feel like the projector goes down and the pointer comes out, and we're just sort of like thinking about craft from this more pragmatic perspective. I don't know, like this book, I learned more about you and writing than I think I have. I mean, how many damn hours of that podcast have we done? And there's something about this particular filter that I think I just wish I hope that this book taught me how much I want more books like this, I guess is another way to say it, how what a service it is, not just in terms of the subject matter, but in terms of like the way it allows a writer to be insightful. You know what I mean?
Thanks. Yeah, that's really kind of you. I mean, I think, I think like, what you're talking about, like that idea where, you're writing about writing. I did feel like this book, my first book, they're very different books in like pretty much every way. And one of the things with my first book, because of the kind of book it was, because of the thing it was about, the thing I was trying to do, like it was really tremendously important to me to be like, look, I need to make sure that even somebody who doesn't read a lot of literary books can access and enjoy, and this needs to be for them.
Okay.
And in a lot of cases, I made decisions that were based on making it for them and not for the literary, but this book was kind of the opposite. And it's not that I don't want to be elitist. I don't want to leave any, but it's like, this is kind of an inside baseball-y book, right? It's kind of like, it probably has a pretty small and pretty focused readership of people who think about these things. And I wanted to go into depth and into like a kind of like, and, bringing in one of the reasons I knew as I was revising it, first, 20 pages in or so, it starts to get into like critical theory, like documentary theory. It's not super heady. It's not like Derrida and but it's fairly dense for a general readership. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of wanted to put that up front as kind of like a warning. Like, look, I'm sorry, but this is kind of what you're getting into. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sorry. Like, I don't want to alienate anybody, and I don't want to be an elitist. I don't want to be some snob, but I want to talk about this thing that I feel like maybe I don't see a lot of other people talking about on the page, and it's about writing, and it's something that I want practitioners to think about, which is the ethics of representation. Mm-hmm. It's basically a book about a lot of things, but on a very real level, it's about portrayal. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to portray another person? And that was kind of an obsession, and so that was part of my obsession with In Cold Blood, because it's really about that. That was my access point, was portrayal. To the first time I read the book, that's what I wrote the paper about.
You were a little. I want to get back to this. You wanted the book to be about the ethics of representation. So don't let me forget. But am I right in thinking that the first time you read the book, kind of relatively cold for this class on the documentary impulse, when your first year of grad school, you already had some questions about representation, even though you were just sort of beginning your journey to think about writing nonfiction and writing about violent crime and things like that. Is that right?
I think so. I think it was probably, if, you know, it's a pretty specialized experience to have somebody very close to you, somebody who you love a lot, be murdered in America. And I think this is one of those things where when I talk to other people who've been through that experience, they immediately know they know exactly what I'm talking about. But it's very hard to translate beyond that. But the idea that, like, the minute somebody dies, they immediately become portrayed. There's this shift in how they're portrayed. And they kind of enter this like symbolic realm. And especially victims of violence, you see it all the time right now, because there are so many victims of violence, of state violence, and, you know, but like on this very real level, they are kind of instantly dehumanized in the portrayals of them. And like, I think I realized that as a 20-year-old, like going through it, but on a very, like, I didn't have the language or the concepts to discuss it. And that's really what Charlie kind of gave me, my professor, Dr. Birch, like, which, you know, is a huge gift if you really think about that. Like that's one of the main reasons I'm a professor, is like, if you can do that for someone, you can try to help give them like the sort of vocabulary. It's, you know, you can kind of open up a lot of things. And I think that class did that for me.
Amen. That's a great, I'm going to put that on my next, like, I'm giving people a language. I think that's right though. But like, I guess my question is, like, it seems like as you developed a deeper relationship with the book, you actually discovered crucial inaccuracies, fabulations, and also inadvertent denials on the part of Capote that he took any liberties. But I wondered if, before you got the receipts, as far as that is concerned, if you kind of were like, maybe it's connected to this thing that Charlie, my friend Charlie, that he gave you the language for. Because I guess I'm bringing this up because I read the book in undergrad. It was like I think it was like a literary journalism class. I think we read James Agee, and well, I guess he wasn't a literary journalist, but we read Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, and we read some kind of book that was set in a home for non-neurotypical people from back in the day. Then we read a Tracy Kidder book, but we read In Cold Blood. And the only thing that I really remember from my first reading of it was I came into class and I said a sentence to my teacher, Patsy Sims. And she was like, you need to just go home and type out pages of this book so you can understand sort of what kind of a lexical tapestry I have bestowed upon you, young Elena. So anyway, so I guess my question is kind of coming from that personalized place, which is like, did you already smell kind of the methinks something's afoot here early on in this documentary impulse class?
I think I did, yeah. And I mean, maybe you must have had this experience, right? You teach creative nonfiction, we teach creative nonfiction, and I think students, or even in a 100 level class, are very good at this. This is an inherent skill. I think they can generally tell. They have suspicions when they're being not lied to, because we basically spend our whole careers like avoiding the truth debate. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
but like,
yeah. Especially you and me.
Yeah. Like, that's not really what I'm saying, but like when they feel like something is being like actively misrepresented, I feel like they can pick things up. And it continues to amaze me, because I really try, and it's hard for me to say if I'm succeeding, but I try to be super objective when I teach In Cold Blood, and I'm very interested in how my students respond. And consistently, I did have that experience in Charlie's class when I first read it. It was this kind of like itch where you're like, something is off about this book, but I don't know what it is. And it's not always the same thing for students, and not all of them experience it, of course, but students will constantly bring up things that I haven't seen yet. You know, they'll talk about, I had a student in this True Crime 101 class mention the way Capote uses parentheticals almost only in Perry Smith's point of view. I had never thought about that. It was like brilliant. And he was like a freshman engineering major who was not, you know what I mean? Really brilliant student, but not necessarily a literary critic, you know what I mean? And so, yeah, I did have that experience, and I'm always interested to see the way like other first-time readers of the book have that experience, which is why I like to teach it.
Yeah, that was an interesting part of the book too, that like, you're an elder millennial who started teaching this book to mostly latter day millennials. And now you've got sort of this new crop of folks who have basically always grown up in a certain kind of news landscape, a certain kind of social media landscape, a certain kind of political landscape that has changed sort of their spectrometer of veracity. But and do you think that they're receiving In Cold Blood differently than, say, the folks who you couldn't keep it on the shelves in 1965?
Yeah, it's really hard to tell because I want to think that, and yet I know how every kind of generation has that like nostalgic, like we
Right.
knew what the truth was back in 92 or whatever. And, you know, the antidote to that kind of thinking, at least the partial one, has been to go back and look at how it was received in 1966.
Mhm.
And it is, like this amazing Esquire article by Philip K. Tompkins comes out 6 months later that basically completely debunks the book. I
Huh.
mean, it debunks huge parts of it in a major magazine, and nobody cares.
Mhm.
It sparks very little comment. Nobody really cares very much, and the acclaim kind of continues. And yeah, Capote is still going on TV claiming to have 99% recall, and just really doing like a really great con job on like the literary publicity industry.
Mhm.
And yeah, so I mean, I guess I find that really fascinating,
Mhm. It's like that thing where like they show the kids what's actually in chicken nuggets, and then the kids still want the chicken nuggets. That there's like it's all just beaks or whatever,
Yeah,
and that's not to condemn the kids. It's just to be like, well, this is. I mean, you say it in the book, right? Like, the facts are one thing, but people don't read. People think they're getting, they want facts, but they don't. They want an accumulation of facts that yields a story, or facts that smell or read like facts that then yield a story.
yeah.
So that's the.
And that's really interesting because I think like when In Cold Blood is kind of like the beginning of the class. By the end, we're talking about very contemporary things. We're talking about serial. We're talking about all these like this whole proliferation of like Netflix documentaries, true crime documentaries. I haven't taught Tiger King yet, but I'm going to.
Oh, please
And
don't.
it's like, I actually have found in practice, I do think there's this like kind of prevalent like narrative that people don't understand that these are really not only not objectively true, whatever that means, but like actively dishonest.
Mhm.
And I think actually in my experience, they mostly do. It's not that everybody's dumb and nobody can tell. I do think people recognize it. It's just like, and we have really like those are the most interesting conversations because I think they understand those kinds of media objects in a way that I don't. And
Mhm.
I see them in a way that they don't. And there's a generational gap in terms of our understandings of truth. But it is really fascinating in teaching these classes because it's almost like a very like ad hoc amateur research into like what are the generational ideas of truth
Yeah.
in media, like what are the understandings and the misunderstandings. And you know I don't have like really the ability to formalize that, but there's a lot of anecdote in the book about what I think based on what I see.
We should say too that this isn't like some kind of like a hatchet job on In Cold Blood, which has already been done like 16 times. Like this is a deep. I felt I felt I felt safe. I felt safe to still kind of revere the book. Despite it's the conversation that people have about the book, like you said at the top, like the thing that Truman Capote had no control over, like the industry that sort of made him want to brand it this thing that it could never live up to be, this nonfiction novel, or like or the fact that people turned it into this sort of like prototype of what we now understand to be true crime media. But I still think that your book, because there's plenty of space to sort of like feel the sort of historical, I mean, delight isn't the right word, but that you can sort of really sit with the things about In Cold Blood that are masterful.
Yeah.
Which is like, I don't know, maybe I could. So this is a really hard question to ask, and I feel like if I asked it on the podcast, you would just like feel like let's talk about this instead. But I feel like you're gonna be nice to me and polite because there's like people over, like we got company. So So this book is like, it refuses to take certain positions in a way that I think is really cool. Like it's not like this book sucks. I've made my peace with this book, which is a kind of resolution, right? This is what should happen with nonfiction. You know, this is, there's no position in this book, even though you think of it essayistically. So like, can you remember when you were putting it together, like if you're not working on that like magnetic binary that people always want, like have an idea, defend it, push it through in a through line, like what kind of like led you through? What was your guidepost if you knew that you were going to be dealing in these kind of nebulous spaces?
Yeah, it is a good question. It is a hard one too.
Yeah, sorry.
I mean, I think like, I guess I didn't want, so, you know, one of the things that the book talks a lot about, and there's a lot of things in the book that are, this is dumb and it's like inside baseball, but it's something I can't stop doing, which is like, I do like things that nobody is going to notice, but like little kind of like homage things to people, to especially to Capote, right? Like the reason the book is 4 sections is one example. It's just like, it's kind of aping In Cold Blood in a lot of ways. It's also a very gossipy book intentionally, because I think Capote would have liked it. Like I wanted to write a book that I thought what I knew of Truman Capote, he would have liked, even if it was critical of him. And he was the most gossipy, just funniest. Like he's great.
Yeah.
Especially his essays. Like his late essays are just glorious. They really are. Nobody reads them. Nobody cares about them, but they're just fantastic. And anyway, like I think one of the other ways in which it's kind of trying to be in dialogue with In Cold Blood in a way that I don't think anybody cares but me cares about or is going to notice, but like In Cold Blood is like fatally flawed by the ending, because he added a fake ending. Because, and he explicitly, it's the one thing he admitted, and he admitted that he needed a sense of closure. He needed a sense of resolution, something cleaner to bring it, the way he put it was to bring it full circle. And so he invents this scene completely. The last scene is completely invented. And I wanted to sort of avoid that. Like when I was thinking of like, where does this go? What is this trying to do? It's not trying to find a resolution. It's about an obsession. And I think it's like, honestly, something I kind of think I've learned mostly from working with you, which is like the essay is more about inquiry than it is about argument. And I do think that's a distinction. I think like you're not trying to have a thesis statement that you defend, like you said, through the whole course of the book, because I find that kind of tedious.
That's so much easier said than done. You know what I mean? Like, maybe it's the thing that you just said, like you play these games with yourself. Like, I'm going to have 4 parts because In Cold Blood had 4 parts. You know, like so rather than an argument or a thing that you just set these little things for yourself that push you forward structurally or push you forward in terms of like false questions maybe. But yeah, sorry, I interrupted you, just like in the—
No, you didn't. No, not at all. I mean, I think like, but yeah, I mean, I do think that idea of inquiry is something we've talked about, and I really think I kind of discovered here. I also kind of came here right as I had just started working on essays for the first time, and I think that was like a really fruitful coincidence. You know what I mean? Because then, like, I mean, not to embarrass, like, you know, you're like a great essay writer. You are, you think about the essay all the time. You teach the essay to our students, and George, our other colleague, is like an amazing writer. He's a great thinker. We exchange work, and I found this kind of like essay-based community that felt like, okay, here's the place where like people are doing the kind of work that I think I want to do. You know what I mean? And so that idea of inquiry is very much based on like being in that environment, I think.
Do it's not, I mean, and it sounds too like, what was the thing that you said that I said I wanted us to come back to, like the ethics of representation? Yeah. Like, I mean, I guess an ethics cannot be, is this right? Maybe if George is here, he'll be able to tell us, but like an ethics has to have a kind of breathing space in it in itself to sort of, right? You, like an ethical practice, you weigh it out to see if it fits or it doesn't fit. It has to have this kind of, it can't be just like a position, right? So
yeah, versus like a poetics. Yeah, I mean, I thought a little bit about that because I do think trying to present anything as like an ethics or a moral argument is pretty dangerous ground,
Moral argument, yeah.
or even an ethical argument. And, the only real difference is like one of them seems a little bit more like institutionalized and practical. Like, the ethics relate to a field or
Mhm.
whatever, whereas like the moral is a more of I guess, kind of absolute. But yeah, I mean, I was kind of interested in, I guess if I'm thinking of like ethics, I was reading a lot of stuff about ethics, about the ethics, like a lot of the documentary film theory is like, I think much better than like creative. We've talked about this creative nonfiction theory, such as it exists. I guess like the nice way to say it is there are large gaps in it.
There are opportunities for it to grow.
Yes, exactly. And so like I found, and it's all Charlie turning me onto it, but like documentary film theory is much, much more advanced in terms of thinking about these kinds of things. And it's really the same, almost all of it translates. And so, thinking about what are the ethics of not just like creative nonfiction, because that doesn't really mean that much anymore, but like, what are the ethics of, I mean, I guess this is an essay, but also true crime. It's an essay about true crime. Maybe it's a true crime essay. I don't know. We don't need more subgenres, but like, what are the ethics of this kind of writing? And thinking about books like, I do think it's in a tradition. I'm not saying I'm doing something new. Like Maggie Nelson is kind of like the bedrock of what this book, like Jane, and it's kind of the books that maybe don't get as much as attention of hers. It's the Art of Cruelty. It's Jane, and it's the Red Parts. And I teach Jane in the Red Parts, and I just those are like the kinds of books I'm trying to write here. And like I think there is a groundwork for like people thinking more ethically and more about the ethics of true crime. And Alex Marzano Lesnevich,
Yes,
that book, The Fact of a Body,
yes.
definitely heavily influenced this.
Oh yeah, they're and they were guests at Oregon State's Visiting Writer Series not too long ago.
That's true,
Back when we had public events. So shout out to OSU for sponsoring that. And all right, so relatedly, is there an ethics so you're exploring the ethics of writing about people, especially people who are victims of a crime, murder victims who then no longer represent themselves in any way, shape, or form. Arguably, the same thing could be said about somebody like Capote. He wasn't murdered, but he is no longer able. So did you find yourself kind of having to revise your ethics when you're talking about the person who you think should have thought more deeply about his ethics and representing people?
That I think that's something I thought a little bit about. I guess I'm not saying this is a satisfactory, like this could be a rationalization. And I thought a lot about like what I was rationalizing and not. And I think you have to rationalize things to finish a nonfiction book.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I did base the book entirely on his public persona. So like, for instance, and a lot of that, honestly, it's not like I made some great moral decision. I was supposed to go to New York to look at his papers, and the pandemic hit like a month before. And so I couldn't. I had a deadline. I couldn't do it. And so I didn't get to go see his papers. I didn't get to see the notes for In Cold Blood. I got to read a lot of other books about those notes, but pretty much everything I based the book on were things he put out into the public. And, it was based on his public output, his public persona, with the exception of maybe the biographies. But the interesting thing about Capote and his authoritative biography by Gerald Clark, Capote, is that he authorized it and participated in it.
So you're kind of presenting like a king of persona making himself.
Yes.
I'm sorry, my phone keeps on going off because one member of the audience is heckling us.
I think more than one are.
Yeah, about certain books. Well, it's not about us, it's about certain books. Yes, it's Caroline who is the publicity genius behind this book. Actually, we should talk about that for just a second before we move on. But Caroline,
she is a genius. And yeah.
So yeah, let's talk about that for the audiobook. Let me just see if there's anything, active thing. Oh, we got to talk about the essay before.
Yeah, sure.
I have a little bit of a lightning round that I want to do with you. You cannot escape, but I have a couple other serious questions. Okay, so the fourth section of the book starts thinking about both you, a fiction writer who then got labeled as a memoirist, who is now sort of understanding his essayistic impulses, and Capote, who in his later life was producing these sort of unlabeled things that you think follow a kind of essayistic path. And you define the essay as, like, I feel like we're gonna have to stop our podcast. You're done. You figured it out. You reached the end of the Mario Brothers. You know, like the prince. You've saved the princess. An act of sense making. This is what an essay is. It separates, arranges, and presents factual material as what it really is: data that requires interpretation. And then later you add that another sort of like component of the essay is an openly biased narrative perspective. Right. So you have a biased or a narrative who's not afraid to sort of be kind of present in the calculation, something that Truman Capote sort of pretended not to do with that third person approach, point of view. And so you're making sense by separating, arranging, and presenting factual material as data that requires interpretation. When did you start feeling your way toward that kind of a definition? Was it making the book that helped you figure it out, or have you always felt this way and just kept it from your co-conspirator? Like, what's going on here?
I think that's probably so. Like, I think I worried about this with the book as a whole. That like, what is it besides a synthesis of a lot of sources? You know what I mean? And I do think I tried to do some things that added to it, but like, I think that definition is probably just a synthesis of like a lot of other stuff I've read. I don't think I'm necessarily making any new arguments or like treading any brand new ground in the book. I think I'm maybe trying to synthesize things in a different way than they might have been combined before. It's kind of like, which, you know, my definition of the essay is like, other than being here and teaching it, which has been a huge influence, not just, you know, I came here and had to start teaching 107, right? Like I had never taught essays specifically before. I had taught like nonfiction generally. And so I moved away from memoir and started working with people who, you know, and, you know, thesis mentoring, like our graduate students. My first thesis student was Stephen Moore, who's, you know, like brilliant. I mean, he was I got here and I was like, well, I mean, you're just like a peer writer. Well, you know, let's just talk about it, I guess. But like, and you learn so much from seeing other people develop their work, not just write it, but revise it. And you see like advice and then they do something else. And you're like, oh no, you were right. Like that's what you were supposed to do. Anyway, I think that definition is kind of a synthesis of a lot of things. I think the essay, in a way, I think of as a synthesis of modes, as a synthesis of like other, I mean, and maybe that's my own bias because I have like a kind of unconventional writing background. I started as a journalist, and then I was an English major, and then I like thought maybe I was going to go get a PhD and do critical writing, but I didn't. I got an MFA in fiction, and then I stopped writing fiction, and then it was a memoirist, and now I write essays and, you know, whatever. But I do think of it as a synthesis of like modes of and of kind of, and in doing that, I also personally do kind of think it kind of transcends. That's why I love it. I think it's better because it is a synthesis of other forms. I do think the essay is better than other forms.
Yeah, me too. And not in that kind of like, it's everything kind of a way, but like, if you look at like this failed later day career of Capote through like what his actual impulses were. I mean, he was obviously very commercially driven, right? Like he sold some kind of thing for $300,000 that was nothing at the end of his career. And he had made enough money to buy a sports car before In Cold Blood even came out. He knew how to create a literary lion out of himself with that Cartier-Bresson photo of him, you know?
Yeah.
But like, so maybe he would have resisted this because he was always looking for sort of the frameable commercial product. But I love the idea that we can revise the way that we see some of the things that he was thinking about toward the end of his life as just sort of like wayward essayism.
Yeah.
You know, like I think that's really generous and cool. And also, you know, not lucrative, but
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we've maybe talked about it, you know, some of the essays he wrote. My favorite writing of Truman Capote's is always the essays. In Cold Blood is great, but if you read the essays, if you read like The Muses Are Heard, it's just this like, yeah, it's like a nonfiction novella where he just follows an American ballet company to Russia in the 50s. And then you read like, you know, Hand Carved Coffins is the one you're talking about, which is like his sequel to In Cold Blood, which is just like totally made up. he has that great Brando profile where he basically ended Marlon Brando's career.
Yeah, talk about gossipy and bitchy. Like,
yeah. And then, he has this great essay where he just goes around with when he's living in New York, he asks the person who cleans his house if he can go around with her one day to the other clients, and she lets him, and they get really high and eat somebody's ice cream, and then like the owners walk in as they're just eating ice cream in the kitchen. It's glorious. His essays are so much fun.
Oh, that's beautiful. All right, so that's and then the name of his like latter prose collection is
Music for Chameleons.
Say it again.
So it's Music for Chameleons. It's his last like real book, although they would put out, so there's like all these posthumous things, it's like a whole cottage industry sort of.
Well, listen, I see you, Courtney. So I know we want to do a Q&A, but I only see 2 Qs. Now somebody else is heckling on my text messages. Sorry about the buzzing.
Go ahead, keep going.
So while you guys are thinking of your questions, on our podcast, I'll Find Myself When I Dead, we always stop with a lightning round. So think of your questions, type them in the chat. I'm gonna throw a couple lightning round questions to Justin about his project, sort of, and you will be graded on these answers. Okay, Justin St Germain, what was Truman Capote's recurring nightmare? Hint: it is a very, very common recurring nightmare.
He had a few, right? He was drowning in one of them. Okay.
I mean, I just Googled one thing. I just Googled fun facts about Truman Capote, so maybe there's more.
He said that he said he had, sorry, I'm just going to give you grim answers. I thought he mentions a lot reliving Perry Smith's hanging.
No. Oh God, no. The listicle I read said that he was a star in a Broadway play and he couldn't remember his lines.
Yeah, that one too. Yeah. Okay. Which is presented as Perry Smith's fantasy in Cold Blood.
Oh shit, you're kidding.
To be Perry McParsons up on the stage in Vegas.
Okay, how about this one? True or false? William S. Burroughs had a cat named Q.
I have no idea.
William S. Burroughs, the only person who like basically outwardly disliked In Cold Blood.
If he did, he probably would have like murdered it or something if he had a cat named Q.
Oh, he loved cats toward the end of his life. He had a cat named Spooner. That was a joke. Okay, how about this? What would you wear to Truman Capote's famous black and white ball? Note there is one correct answer.
Are you going to say the white tuxedo I wore to prom? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It wasn't just a white tuxedo, was it?
White jacket. It had tails.
Yeah, a white tuxedo with tails. Yeah, with Natalie Wood and Frank Sinatra.
Had a white bow tie. I think it might have been a black shirt.
Ew.
Yeah, it's good.
Children's party musician to your prom. Or magician. Okay, how about this? How cold is blood? At what actual temperature does blood freeze?
I don't know. Does it? I guess it must eventually.
26 degrees Fahrenheit. All right.
It's high.
True or false? Truman Capote is the subject of Carly Simon's famous song, You're So Vain.
He could be.
That is not a true or a false.
No, wasn't it Eric Clapton?
Look at Caroline in the chat. Caroline Casey, publicist to the stars, is correct. It's false. I believe it's David Geffen, if I'm not mistaken.
Warren Beatty.
No, Warren Beatty is the common misconception. Check your facts. Actually, I don't even know if it's David Geffen either. I prepared for this like 5 seconds before we went on. Okay.
I can't tell at all.
Okay, 2 more. True or false? Truman Capote was once the winner of a Truman Capote lookalike contest.
Oh, he would totally do that. I'm going false. I'm going true. I'm going that he did that.
It is sort of true. He is extra in the Woody Allen film Annie Hall, and Woody Allen says, "Hey, look, it's the winner of the Truman," and it was actually Truman Capote. Last question: do you do an impersonation of Truman Capote's voice, and if so, will you do it for us right now?
I don't have that. I'm tone deaf, and I can't do anything in a high register. I don't even know if I'm like, I don't think I can do it. I think I'll hurt myself. Arlo could do it, although he just had his tonsils out.
Oh, okay. Well, next time you write another book about Truman Capote and In Cold Blood. Maybe if you write a book about the grass harp, then.
I don't like his fiction much.
All right. Hey, Courtney.
I have truly loved that Elena has taken this opportunity to just like throw everything out to you because you can't escape. It's really great to watch.
This is what it works like.
We do have a few questions from the audience. And I'm just going to read them out, and you guys can both take an opportunity to answer them, whatever you want. So Melissa asks, as you discovered more about the reality of the Clutter murders, how did you feel about Capote adding untrue events, putting his own emotions onto other people, e.g. Dewey closing his eyes? Did you find yourself wanting to do that when you were writing Son of a Gun? And then lastly, and could you have written this book if you hadn't written Son of a Gun?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Those are, maybe I'm gonna start with the last one and hope I remember the other ones. No, I definitely could not have written this book if I hadn't written Son of a Gun, because a lot of it is, and when I say it's like inside baseball, I was really hesitant. I don't like to write about like my own book, but I couldn't not write about the experience of publishing a book about murder because it paralleled, like it didn't in lots and lots of ways, but the ways in which my book did and did not parallel Capote's book are kind of like the meat of and the inspiration for this one. So I definitely could not have done it without that. And then in terms of the untrue events and putting things in other people's perspectives, I talk a little bit about this in the book, but I actually tried to, in the first draft, write these, like, there were these little vignettes that were super voicey and were like in third person in my mom's point of view, trying to like reconstruct. It was like trying to compensate for this idea I'm talking about of like portraying dead people where they get flattened out and they get marginalized, and trying to like reanimate, but it was also like kind of fictional. And so it was very dubious, like ethically. And in any case, my editors were like, get rid of all of this. And so I did, but I mean, I guess I had tried some of the same techniques. And I mean, I know why he did it, because he talked a lot about why he did it. Because his number, like his sort of, if we can say ethics are individual, his ethics were like, I am leaving myself out. How nonfiction becomes art is that you leave yourself out of it completely, and tell it with the formal architecture or formal techniques of a novel. And so he did have like a real artistic purpose behind what he was doing. I don't know that I agree with it, but I also don't know that he would care, you know?
Okay. And then Lainey Turner asks, if a person wants to read your book, Justin, would you recommend reading In Cold Blood first or after?
If you have the time, probably first. I think it might kind of ruin the experience to read my book first. I guess I shouldn't say that. Yes, read mine, buy mine. Yeah, but no, I mean, honestly, I think if I were in that situation, I'd probably want to read In Cold Blood first.
I would just say that Justin does a great job presenting. I haven't read In Cold Blood in 20 years or maybe 15 years, but Justin does a really good job of presenting the book in a way that it feels like you have enough information to work with the material and work with his ideas. So you certainly don't have to have the book right at the forefront of your memory to engage with Justin's book.
Okay. And then Brenna asked, how do we move past our own baggage to write about our murdered relatives and the complexity of family dynamics? We've talked about this before, but not recently.
Hi, Brenna. Yeah, I think maybe we need to talk about that over a beer, but you know, and which would be great. But I think like, that's like the question I wish I could answer. And you know, I think what happened for me is all I can tell you. And that's like, I did it. And I think I'm afraid it comes off as disingenuous in the book, but there was this moment where I had written this book and I thought it was like, what I was doing was okay. And this is, I think, very similar to what Capote had, right? I thought what I was doing was okay because I thought I had some higher purpose about like, well, I'm going to keep my mother from being forgotten. I'm going to like respect and honor. But I'm not sure that that's an okay justification. And I had this moment right before it got published where I like really had a panic and it happens in the book. I mean, actually, weirdly enough, it kind of happens in Holcomb. And I really did have this moment where I was like, what the hell did I just do? You know? And it was too late. And the only thing I can say is like, and I think it's probably impossible to be prepared for that moment. I think you have to do the thing to have that moment, but like, I guess try to be aware that that's a possibility. that things will change a lot between the writing and the publishing, and that like you can't ever take it back. And I wouldn't want to take my book back, but like this is, if there's like one moral to the story of like writing about people who've been murdered specifically, it's in this book, it's like it ruined Truman Capote. It ruined his life. And it like, that's not a controversial position. It's not just me that says that, it's all of his friends, everybody. You can just look at his life. He never recovered. His own biographer literally said that exact phrase. He never recovered from In Cold Blood. And I mean, I think I've recovered from my book because it wasn't that successful. Like it wasn't that, In Cold Blood was everywhere. It was like this thing. And so there's a real risk, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I think you should do it. I'm not trying to discourage anybody, because I do think that a lot of those things I was saying as possible reasons to do it are valid and real. And it also, I think the idea of like therapy, writing as like therapy or for personal reasons is complicated, but I do think it is also real that like the writing process can help. It's not to say it will, but it can in certain ways. And so I would say everybody should absolutely write about it. If like, for instance, if you're in a situation where, you have a loved one who, was a victim of violence, absolutely should write about that. I also think that you probably want to think a little bit about before you publish it. Not to say you shouldn't, I just think, just think about the effect it might have on other people, on you, on, yeah, and that's not a satisfactory answer. And I wish I had a satisfactory answer to that question. It's like the one question I wish I did have that answer to, but I don't.
It sounds like you're saying sort of too, like, just build some space for that in what you imagine publishing to be. Like build some space for the moment in which you're going to have that reckoning. Understand that that's the same as copy edits or other things. It's just maybe when we think about this as a practice, we don't, you always know that your book is going to be copy edited, right? Maybe if you're writing about this particular subject matter, you need to understand that those kinds of emotional pockets and reckonings are part of the publication process.
And remember, like also that, and Capote is the cautionary tale, that you might think your book is an artistic work, but the minute it gets in anybody else's hands, it becomes a product. And you're going to have to watch that story become a product that's marketed and in ways that you can't control. And that part of it, I think, even more so than like writing it or sending it out, but like when it was about to come out too, and like I saw the way people were talking about it, and it's not that it was bad. I mean, I think I was very lucky, in fact, but it's a very surreal experience.
All right, we actually have a lot of questions, so we might go over if that's okay with you guys.
I have time, yeah. I mean, I don't want to keep anybody if you need to eat dinner or whatever, you don't have to hang out, but thank you for coming.
Susan Rogers says, "You're both awesome. Justin, can't wait to read the book. I have two questions. What makes a murder story American? And Toby Jones or Philip Seymour Hoffman?"
Hi, Sue. Also, incidentally, Susan Jackson Rogers, also a wonderful essayist. She was hiding it from us for the longest time, and I don't know why. But
you're hiding her essays under a bushel, as they
writes
say.
great essays. Okay, so last one, yeah, definitely Philip Seymour Hoffman. That was the question, right? Philip Seymour Hoffman, yeah, absolutely, yeah, not even close. The other question is great, and what makes it American? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but like the way I teach it, and so when I had to kind of first teach the class, I love this process, but I don't always know if my students do. We have to kind of like, and honestly, I think I probably stole this from you, Elena. I reverse engineer where it's like, we're answering a question. I'm not telling you what a thing is in this class. We're going to figure out by reading a bunch of them. So like we read a bunch of true crime and then we're like, because Elena does that a lot with the essay. And so I'm like, I'm going to reverse engineer this thing, right? And so we reverse engineer this definition, and it winds up usually being like one big thing about American true crime is like, and this is spread. It's hard to tell what's American anymore because American culture is just kind of like propagated everywhere, but a really intense focus on the murderer as opposed to the victims. And there's this 4-part thing that my students and I kind of realized that almost everything tracks to. And so you get, and now I'm going to forget it, but it's like the crime itself, the investigation, the trial, and the execution. And like you see, you can, and it's not every single piece of true crime, but almost every single one we read tracks. It covers those 4 fundamental elements. And so I guess that's probably how I would answer it, but I'm still kind of trying to figure it out as I teach this class more and more. But thanks, Sue, that's a great question. And thank you for being here.
All right, Kay says, hi, what do you think about character representation of Dick and Perry? Dick postures as ultra masculine while Perry is often depicted as feminine by Capote. Bonnie and Clyde much?
Yeah, thanks, Kay. Hi, Kay. It's nice to hear from you again. I can't see you, but I'm glad you're here. Yeah, no, I think you kind of touched on like, there's a part in the book, and this is not my observation. It's a critic named Ralph Voss, who wrote this really great critical book called Truman, Capote and the Legacy of In Cold Blood, like 5 or 6, 8 years ago. Anyway, he pointed this out to me first, which is like, it's pretty clear that Dick Hickok and Perry Smith were in a romantic relationship. I mean, there's lots and lots of, I mean, it's actually harder to find evidence that they weren't if you start looking at it. But, and this came up a lot with Capote, the book kind of addresses this. Capote actively left that out. He actually denied explicitly to Plimpton, George Plimpton, who wrote a book about him. In an interview, he denied explicitly, directly. Plimpton said, did they have a sexual relationship? And he said, absolutely not. But pretty much everybody else said they did. And I think that whole part of the way he creates Dick Hickok as like this like uber masculine, like proto male figure is because he's trying to avoid. He's trying to avoid, and honestly, it's not his fault. It's because he knew. He had published books. He and Gore Vidal were essentially like the 2 mainstream breakout gay writers in their first novels, and then they became like bitter enemies to the death. But you know, so Capote had seen what happened when you wrote books about gay characters, and what happened was you got really criticized like very homophobically and vitriolically in the press and by readers. And so I think he knew he wanted In Cold Blood to be a blockbuster. And so I think he made a pretty conscious decision to try to de-emphasize or even hide like their relationship in order to, and part of that is by making Dick Hickok this like super masculine caricature of a person, because most of the people who talk about him actually, I think the other side of the Perry Smith thing where he's made into the hero is that Dick Hickok is, I think, also misportrayed in the book. I think from what other people say, he was a much more like agreeable and decent, I mean, decent for a serial killer, but like a much more, people liked Dick Hickok much better, everybody, except Capote. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot going on in those 2 portrayals, and I probably only realized some of it.
All right, the last question is from Riley. Justin, can you talk to us about Philip Seymour Hoffman's Capote?
Yeah. Hey, Riley, how's it going? Yeah, I love that book, or I love that movie. It came out weirdly enough during that class. Like I saw Capote, I think it came out, I want to say it was like 3 weeks after we read In Cold Blood. So like in 2005 in Charlie's class, I think he planned it that way because Charlie's kind of a brilliant class planner. And it was a very film heavy class. We did a lot. It was film, you know, documentary meant film and prose. And so I read In Cold Blood for the first time and then saw Capote and wrote a little bit about it. And it's quoted in the book, like, because we had to keep these like class blogs in that class to keep track of our readings. And I found them. And I thought it was great, but I wondered why it only focuses on this tiny little sliver of his life. Right? It only focuses on In Cold Blood, which is 6 years. So he starts writing In Cold Blood at 35 and the movie ends at 41. And I do think that's really interesting, but I find Capote's life to be incredibly interesting outside of that frame. You know, I mean, when I read, you know, for a 650 page biography or whatever it is, Capote by Gerald Clark is like magnificent. That book is so good. And maybe it's just because I love Truman Capote, but like it's so readable and so cool. And his life is so interesting. He knew everybody in the world. He was friends with JFK. He was friends with Marilyn Monroe. He was friends with James Baldwin. He was friends with princes, kings. He was everybody who was famous in like between 1955 and like 1970, Truman Capote knows. And so I love that movie a lot. And I think Philip Seymour Hoffman is just like, you know, that's one of those, it's like one of those performances. It's like the Heath Ledger Joker, but even better, I think. Like, and I think that's part of the myth of In Cold Blood. You know, there is this, sorry, I'm rambling, but since you asked about films, there is like a real kind of narrative that In Cold Blood was a curse. Like anybody who touches In Cold Blood. And so like, so you think about like, so In Cold Blood, the movie In Cold Blood comes out a year later. Capote like advises on it. So not only did In Cold Blood destroy Capote eventually, it also, they filmed part of the movie in 1967 in the Clutter house. And the interviews with the people that were involved, they talk about being like having nightmares for decades afterwards. And the guy who plays Perry Smith, Robert Blake, who was an undiscovered actor at the time in the 90s, I think, or the early 2000s, gets arrested in a very high profile murder case for killing his wife in Hollywood. So it's like this very strange thing where like In Cold Blood, anybody who kind of gets involved with it in any way, there's a lot of people who have had like really unfortunate events happen to him. And I think people lump Philip Seymour Hoffman into that, whether or not that's like accurate. But yeah. So yeah, I love the movie. I think it's really cool. Maybe you have to focus it to make a good 2-hour movie. You have to focus it down to that one little window, but it's also really close. I think, I mean, you watch Philip Seymour Hoffman, go watch Capote in YouTube, like go look up Truman Capote on YouTube. He's on all these talk shows and like Philip Seymour Hoffman channeled him. Actually, Elena, what do you think? You know acting way more than I do.
Yeah, he does the voice great because he doesn't do an impression of the voice. He makes his body, he puts his body into the situation to breathe and hold like the voice, which I think is really good. I was going to say, it's good though that Quincy Jones, who won an Oscar for the score for In Cold Blood, he seems to have done okay curse wise. So I'm glad that he didn't, he made it through.
All right, that was all the questions. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Justin and Elena. This has been a great conversation. I was super happy to be a part of. Thank you, everyone who stayed and watched. It was a great audience, and we can't have these awesome events without you guys, so we really appreciate it. Again, you can buy Justin's book and Elena's essays from Grassroots from our website or stop by the store. And yeah, thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Can I say one thing real quick?
Yeah.
Hey, thank you, Courtney, and thank you, Elena, so much. And also, if you buy the book from Grassroots and you want a free audio version, holler at me because I can give you one. I recorded one and I can just send you a download link. But you have to buy it from Grassroots. Like you have to support Grassroots. Whatever you can, email is on my website. I think it's just Justin at Justin St Germain. Just email me the receipt or whatever, and I'll send you the link.
It's a great job with the audiobook. Really, really nicely done. So don't sleep on that opportunity, y'all.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Bye.